Welcome to How You Came to Be. Denzel Washington is one of the most iconic American actors, both on screen and on stage, the recipient of Academy Awards, Golden Globe Awards, and a Tony Award. He has been married to his wife Pauletta for 38 years and is the father of 4 children. But who made Denzel the man that he is? Denzel Hayes Washington Jr. was born December 28, 1954, in Mount Vernon, New York, to Denzel Hayes Washington Sr. and Lenny Lowe. He was one of 3 children, and although his parents divorced when he was young, his mother, the owner of a beauty salon, sent him to private school to keep him out of trouble. Denzel Sr. was born October 5, 1909, in Buckingham County, Virginia. He was a Pentecostal minister who operated churches in Mamaroneck, New York, and Dillwyn, Virginia. He married Lenny Lowe on November 5, 1949. Denzel Sr. was the son of William Washington Jr., a farmer from Virginia. William Washington was born in 1875. He married Virginia Page on August 2, 1899. A newspaper article details the double wedding of William and his brother John, who were married the same day with their wives living a short distance apart. According to the 1910 U.S. Census, William worked on a farm which he owned, but he was not able to read or write. William Jr. was the son of William Washington Sr., who was likely born into slavery in 1842. It is difficult to know what life was like for William Sr. as a slave, as there are few records pertaining to black individuals at that time. However, Booker T. Washington, the first leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, was born into slavery in Virginia, just 100 miles south of where William lived. William Washington was about 14 years older than Booker T. Washington. Though they are of no known relation, an excerpt from Booker T's autobiography, Up From Slavery, is the closest depiction we have of what William's life may have been like. I was born in a typical log cabin, about 14 by 16 square feet. The cabin was without glass windows. It had only openings in the side which let in the light, but also the cold, chilly air of winter. There was no wooden floor in our cabin, the naked earth being used as a floor. There was no cooking stove on our plantation, and all the cooking for the whites and slaves my mother had to do over an open fireplace, mostly in pots and skillets. While the poorly built cabin caused us to suffer with cold in the winter, the heat from the open fireplace in summer was equally trying. Of my ancestry I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including no doubt my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship while being conveyed from Africa to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family beyond my mother. The early years of my life, which were spent in the little cabin, were not very different from those of thousands of other slaves. My mother, of course, had little time in which to give attention to the training of her children during the day. She snatched a few moments for our care in the early morning before her work began, and at night after the day's work was done. I was asked not long ago to tell something about the sports and pastimes which I engaged in during my youth. Until that question was asked, it had never occurred to me that there was no period of my life that was devoted to play. From the time that I can remember anything, almost every day of my life had been occupied in some kind of labor. William Sr. had just reached adulthood at the time of Emancipation, which changed his life forever. Booker T's account gives some insight into what that might have been like. Finally, the war closed, and the day of freedom came. It was a momentous and eventful day to all upon our plantation. We had been expecting it. Freedom was in the air, and had been for months. The night before the eventful day, word was sent to the slave quarters to the effect that something unusual was going to take place at the big house the next morning. There was little, if any, sleep that night. All is excitement and expectancy. Early the next morning, word was sent to all the slaves, old and young, to gather at the house. In company with my mother, brother, and sister, and a large number of other slaves, I went to the master's house. All of our master's family were either standing or seated on the veranda of the house, where they could see what was to take place and hear what was said. There was a feeling of deep interest, or perhaps sadness, on their faces, but not bitterness. As I now recall the impression they made upon me, they did not at that moment seem to be sad because of the loss of property, but rather because of parting with those with whom they had reared, and who were in many ways very close to them. The most distinct thing that I now recall in connection with the scene was that some man, who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation. After reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, and that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never see. For some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted for a brief period, for I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them. William Washington was 22 years old at the time of emancipation. For a young man to finally be able to build his own life, yet unable to read or write, I expect the feelings of joy and apprehension were overwhelming. William stayed in Virginia, and by 1870 he was living alongside his father, John Washington, farming with his wife Margaret and 2 young sons. William and his entire family were described as mulatto, so the Washingtons have white ancestors, though sadly being of mixed race at this time was probably the result of a non-consensual relationship. By 1880, William continued living and working close to his father, John. It appears that being an involved father is a trait that dates back many generations in the Washington family. Denzel's mother, Lenny, was born on April 4, 1924. Lenny was the daughter of Tillman Lowe and Eliza Jackson. Tillman and Eliza were married in February 1908 in Baker County, Georgia, and had 7 children before moving to New York City as part of the Great Migration. Between World War I and World War II, roughly 2 million African Americans left the South in search of a better life in the North and West. By 1930, Tillman was working as a janitor at an apartment building, and Eliza as a servant. By 1940, the family was living on Fifth Avenue in New York City, and Eliza was no longer working, while Tillman worked as a porter carrying luggage for a steamship. Eliza Jackson was born in March 1891 in Georgia to William Jackson and Rachel Keaton. According to the 1900 census, William was born in 1840 in Virginia. Like William Washington, William Jackson was a young man at the time of emancipation, and his experience may have been similar to that of Booker T. Washington. It is unclear if William relocated to Georgia before or after emancipation, but in 1873 he married Rachel, who was born in Georgia, like both of her parents. Rachel gave birth to 11 children, of which 6 survived. Rachel and William Jackson were likely both born into slavery, but their granddaughter Lenny became a business owner, and their great-grandson Denzel an actor. Quite a turn of events for only a few generations. The story of Denzel Washington, the first African American to be featured on How You Came to Be, has the dark story of slavery as the base of his American family tree, forced immigration followed by a life of servitude and struggle. But according to Booker T. Washington, with emancipation there was no bitterness towards the white individuals who were caught in the cycle of slavery in the 19th century. And following emancipation, like Denzel's white counterparts, there is the common thread of continually searching for a better life, which led Denzel to who he is today, a successful and well-respected man. Denzel was part of a multi-generational commitment to build a better life. It requires grandparents like Tillman Lowe, who moved north in search of new opportunities, followed by mother Lenny Lowe Washington, who built a successful business and worked to keep her children out of trouble, and children like Denzel, who managed to avoid the pitfalls of youth that led many of his childhood friends to jail, to each do their part to improve life for future generations. Perhaps it is this example that can move us further from a dark past towards a brighter future for all.